Hello, welcome to our session on fundraising and mental health. And I'm delighted to introduce our guest who's going to help us explore this topic, David Murray. And David is the Chief Executive of Sustainability First, which is a think tank and charity that works to promote practical solutions to improve environmental, social, and economic well-being. And as well as being an experienced chief executive, David is also a very experienced fundraiser. And he's a longtime friend of mine and ChangeStar's, back from the days where we helped him to produce some really great appeals for the Green Party. This is many years ago now. So it's great to have him here. So welcome, David. Firstly, thank you for being open to sharing your experiences on mental health. I think it's an important conversation and it's great you're stepping up to discuss it. I thought it might be good just before we start, just to mention a couple of important things. Firstly, the sort of fact that the things that we're going to discuss in this are not medical or expert advice, obviously. They're the experiences and views of people who've been through this issue. And secondly, even more importantly, if you are experiencing any problems, then please seek help. Go to your local GP or healthcare provider, and we'll repeat that throughout the call. So first of all, David, welcome, and why are we talking about this issue, do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So I think, firstly, we're talking about it because we really should be talking about it. So I think we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years a really kind of positive shift in kind of the cultural views and values related to mental health well-being in the UK, and a much better understanding of it. It's become much less of a taboo subject inside and out of work, and that's undoubtedly been hugely helpful to individuals and to us kind of collectively as a society. So but there are still times and places where probably it's not talked about where it should be, and maybe one of those places is actually within the world of fundraising and within the slightly wider context of working for charities. I think we're all quite often, by the nature of the work that we do, the types of characters that come towards these roles often have quite altruistic outlooks and often have quite selfless kind of approach to life, and are thinking about other people a lot of the time, but aren't necessarily thinking about themselves at the same time, or are thinking about themselves but in a different way from how they are about others.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can explore that in a moment about sort of, what is it about fundraising that makes it hard on our mental health, particularly. And I think also we just want to open up the conversation, don't we, really, about mental health in the fundraising sector and in the charity sector specifically, and at least start sharing some stories and honest experiences about it. So, as I say, we're really grateful that you've offered to share your experiences of mental health and what you've learned. And I think this will be hopefully really useful for people to take away and open up more of a conversation in the sector overall about it. So, what do you think? What is it about fundraising in the charity sector? You've said a little bit that that makes it quite hard on our mental health.
Yeah, so I think firstly, if you just look at the role and the way that fundraising tends to be set up compared with other roles that might exist within an organisation, they're very clear targets. It's very obvious if you're succeeding or failing. And so the pressure on you is huge. And clearly the role and the responsibilities of that role kind of do have a real kind of impact on the overall health of the organisation. So the stakes are really high, and it's very public, at least internally in an organisation. It's a very public role. So if you're not succeeding, then everybody knows about it. And so it's not the same as lots of other roles that might not have quite as tangible KPIs attached and very clear kind of sums of money to be raised. And I think that therefore does set you up for high stakes, high pressure kind of working environment. You know what you've got to work towards. There's
also sort of an assumption sometimes, I think, from people who aren't fundraisers that that it's quite easy and that the money will just come in, yeah. which perhaps adds a bit of extra pressure, because this. Yeah, I don't know whether it's the lack of recognition, but just it's people not seeing the challenge and the pressure that you are actually under.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you look, if you were to look at even the percentages of success for a successful appeal, if you're looking at a cash appeal, success might be 9 to 11% of all of the people that you've written to responding positively. So 9 out of 10 times on average, somebody's going to say no or completely ignore you. So actually, even when you're being really successful, the majority of the time you're failing, and so it's a strange point of perspective to start from, and I don't think people do understand just how tough fundraising can be.
Yeah, and I think an overall factor with the charity sector as well is this sense of mission, as you've talked about, that that we each have to make the world better, and perhaps a misguided sense that the issues we're trying to solve and that we're all really committed to are actually more important than our own health.
Yeah,
And I think you gave the analogy when we talked about this session a few weeks ago that it's a bit like putting the oxygen mask on a plane. You put your own oxygen mask on before you put anybody else's on that you're trying to help. And that does seem to make sense. But I think this is compounded sometimes by organizations. And I've worked with quite a lot of organizations, one or two quite big names, that you wouldn't say they exploited people necessarily, but they came fairly close to that because they had the idea that, well, we're here to save the world, so you better be prepared to do almost anything. Yeah, you're either on board or you're not, and that can be very difficult for people and put them under a lot of pressure, I think.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, so I think it's something that we need to be aware of for layers of reasons. There's our own kind of self-worth and self kind of health perspective. There's awareness of the role of the fundraiser, and then there's the role that we could play in helping to educate colleagues and employers around us as well.
So perhaps we could get onto your own experience of all of this and of mental health issues. So maybe perhaps you could start by giving us a little bit of your background, sort of set the scene on just where you're at, and then maybe how your mental health issues developed and what they were.
Yeah. So I've worked for like 16 or 17 years now in the voluntary sector. 4 years in the CEO role at the Green Party, but apart from that, everything's been within charities, within not-for-profits of some description. And I've never had an exclusive fundraising role, but I've worked for lots of small organisations where fundraising has been a kind of key component of the work that I've taken forwards. So I've either done it myself or I've worked closely with somebody who has that fundraising role. And so we've talked a bit briefly about the kind of the pressure and the high stakes kind of nature of fundraising, which of course is can be a kind of a bit of a toxic mix for mental health and well-being. But we haven't talked about kind of the external factors of life in general, which can also be pressured and stressful and cause anxiety as well. And even though we often do it consciously or subconsciously, we try to make these kind of two selves of us as human beings and us as employees. We're the same individual going through the same single life. We just happen to be either at work or home. So obviously the two are intertwined, and if you've got stress outside of work, it's going to come into work and vice versa. So I think my biggest kind of shock from a mental health perspective was probably within the first year or so of my first CEO role at the Green Party. So partly it was the leap up to a leadership position from a middle management position that was high stakes. It's also, political parties are extremely high pressure environments to work in. They're very kind of publicly accessible. There's lots of pressure on you to perform, and you've got very hard and fast deadlines to work to with elections. And for us at the time, we were busy trying to win our first ever parliamentary seat, so the stakes were really, really high. So there's that kind of context, but then also in life, on the first day I was due to start in that job, our first child was born, and so I took paternity leave for the first 2 weeks that I was due to start that job. And unbeknownst to my wife and to me, Ruth had OCD, so she'd been struggling with anxiety and depression on and off throughout her life from her teens, and it was probably OCD from the start, but it was never properly diagnosed. It basically misdiagnosed, and so all of the symptoms of anxiety and depression were there, but it wasn't, the underlying causes of it weren't known, and so the treatment for that wasn't known. And it was also perinatal, which means that it was most likely to be at its worst around the time that she is pregnant or has gone through childbirth. And some of that, again, you often hear about baby blues and that kind of lull and depression that can happen a few months on from giving birth. So again, she could be misdiagnosed with having that kind of baby blues thing when actually she was, really, really struggling. So those two things combined, that caused quite a lot of pressure on both of us. Ruth was really struggling. There's a kind of shaking of identity. You know, suddenly I've gone from being a middle manager and a husband to being a senior manager and a dad, and not realizing it as well, that, you know, I was also having to, in a way, be a carer of some description as well, you know, to have that role of caring for Ruth through that kind of difficult time for her. And since then, we've had 4 children. So she's gone through that process again 3 more times. Part of the reason that we decided to stick with it was that we wanted to have a big family, and we didn't want the OCD to be defining of us and our life, and to kind of take it on head on. And so then the second time that Ruth was fell pregnant, she still hadn't been diagnosed, but this time towards the end of the pregnancy, she was diagnosed with OCD, which was a huge kind of almost epiphany kind of moment and a release of freedom, a sense of freedom for Ruth, because of having that definition and understanding. All of a sudden, we could know more about what the condition was and how best to manage it. But to get to that point, she had to get much worse before that diagnosis happened. So she was basically suicidal whilst heavily pregnant with our second child. So there was a real risk that instead of having a big family, it was going to be just me and my daughter, and Ruth gone through a really kind of torrid experience. So again, it was a really tough time, but at least this time we had that kind of sense of understanding and a kind of a liberation through improved knowledge about the care that Ruth was going to get.
I'm curious, David, sorry to interrupt, I'm curious about how those, you know, those two things meeting, you know, that your home life and the pressure in your work, how that felt at the time. You know, what did it feel like to be in your head at that time, especially when you're trying to perform and rise to that point as a CEO?
Yeah, so I think it was really high pressure kind of. There was rarely an opportunity to not have a place, you know, a safe place to go and kind of unwind and let off steam and de-stress, because home life was pressured in lots of ways and work life was pressured in lots of ways, and I was doing long hours on the job and you know, weekends working here and there as well. So there's lots of time that I was being pulled towards work, plus the kind of the pressures at home. Home were tough as well. So there was nowhere to turn to get away from either of those kind of sets of pressures. They were different pressures, but they were all essentially building. And so what I was going to say next was that actually that's probably what caused my own mental health to deteriorate. Up until this point, I felt, you know, extremely lucky. I had a very lucky upbringing and no big traumas of any kind throughout my childhood, and a very loving family, and everything was fine. And so I suppose the flip side of that is that I haven't learned resilience in the way that lots of people do when they have really kind of tough, torrid experiences in their own lives. And so that resilience was something I had to learn on the hoof as an adult in this kind of context. So I think I probably had a post-traumatic kind of trigger of my own anxiety, and which then led to low mood and depression, and then ever since it's been kind of up and down over the last 10 or so years that I've gone through little bouts of it. I've certainly, from seeing others, I've never experienced it extremely badly. I've never had that kind of sense of suicidal thoughts or ever felt like life's not worth living, but I've certainly struggled to get through times as well.
I wonder if you could just sort of elaborate on that, of how this stuff has affected you, for example, you know, in the workplace and in carrying out things. Is it sort of a lack of confidence? Is it just feeling just pressure and no one to talk to about it, and not really being able to get support? How does it sort of manifest itself? Because I'm sure this is the sort of thing that probably quite a lot of people will empathize with, I suspect.
Yeah, so I think in a work context, firstly, there's a sense of loneliness that can often come with being a CEO as well, that you haven't necessarily got peers around you who, even if you've got friendships, they're not necessarily, you know that there's still that kind of management relationship that's going on as well. And so it can definitely affect performance. I think in particular around kind of confidence and assertiveness, and a sense of sometimes feeling like you're an imposter, the kind of imposter syndrome as well. So it can kind of undermine your own confidence and feeling of self-worth. And you can kind of spiral into some negative thoughts about yourself, and then those kind of repeatedly perpetuate a feeling of anxiety and a feeling of underperformance, which is also rationally it doesn't make sense, because you've got examples of performance at work that prove to you that you're doing fine, you're doing either an okay job or a good job at times, and that's but it's difficult to believe that that's because you feel the opposite. You feel like that's not working. So it's tough. It's quite a struggle, and there are times as well you feel like it's difficult. It's not easy to share that information with others. I've also recently, as you know, Richard, worked for a charity that was in a financial turnaround situation. So it was really, again, high pressured. But I made the decision at the time not to tell the small team about just how tough financially things were, because I wanted to protect them from that sense of stress. And I was worried that maybe some of those people would just decide to move on to find something that was better, or at least more secure. And then it came to a point where I just had to tell them, because it was getting really close to the point of putting people at risk of redundancy. Unfortunately, we worked our way out of it. But what was obvious, a hard-learned lesson at that time, was that if I told them from the start, then all of them would have done what they did do anyway, which was to offer their support and try to find ways to help raise the cash and secure the future of the charity. We all believed in it, wanted to work there.
Because that's a huge burden for you to carry, isn't it? I mean, I guess anybody who's got a team with them, it's quite easy to carry the burden in trying to help people out, but you end up causing yourself damage, I suspect.
Yeah, exactly. So again, it was just really, stressful. But just knowing and learning that, talking about it with people was actually probably the best thing to do in the first instance.
I was going to ask, actually, as you were talking through, the history of it, did you find were there sources of support at some of the places, or actually is that one of the sort of key things that you think is not available and is quite difficult to find, is finding that support when you need it, particularly in causes that have this really, really strong social or political mission, that actually there's this tunnel vision in them and actually they don't look after their people so well?
Yeah, so I think it might be true that probably lots of charities are underinvested when it comes to mental health support. And so, I haven't yet worked in an organisation that's got a mental health first aider or a particularly large HR function that allows for that kind of pastoral support and the support you might get from a large, what I imagine you might get in a large corporate setting. I was quite pleasantly surprised to hear that, the cost of private healthcare and private health insurance are very affordable and manageable, even for charity budgets. By employee, it's a matter of pounds per month per employee, so it's a manageable number, and that can give you access to then professional help that could come to you quicker than you might get through the NHS, because that's the other problem, of course, is that the NHS waiting list can be really substantial, and because of that, the triaging that's done for mental health means that if you're not really suffering, then actually you're often at the end of the queue, and the queue doesn't really ever get much shorter. So having access to that support can take a long time to materialize as well. So finding ways to secure that same support but through private means is not a bad idea, and it's something that I've certainly seen firsthand as being something that's worth considering from an employer's perspective.
So I wonder, I mean, that leads us nicely onto sort of what you did about it. Are there some, I mean, first of all, it sounds like it's quite hard to sort of know where to start when you're in a hole like that, and when you're under pressure, particularly when you feel that you're responsible for the organization or a team or whatever it might be. So how did you sort of start being able to pull some solutions together, maybe for your self-care or for how to move on with this?
So yeah, I think the first thing that I did, like any big problem, I did nothing for a while.
So it's a good start. It's
yeah,
the way to start. Yeah.
you know, and unsurprisingly, nothing changed. In fact, if anything, things got slightly worse. So so I definitely would recommend that if you feel like something's not right, then probably it is not right, and you don't need to wait for somebody else to come and legitimize how you're feeling. You know, you should just go and find that help. So I did. In the first instance, I went to my GP and was referred to counsellors for cognitive behavioural therapy, and that was online as well. So I did through a company called IESO, but they're contracted by the NHS trusts in my area, and I think they're national. I had a course of, I think it was weekly, kind of 1 hour sessions on a chat-based, like MSN Messenger type style system, where you could go through a therapy session and talk through learning various tactics that relate to your thoughts and actions and behaviours, and that was really, really helpful. And I think if there's one thing to learn from that, is that you get all of these resources that you kind of build up over the course of these courses that you then have always got access to, so that if you ever feel like you're falling back or having a bad day, you should look back at them, because there'll be something there that might be useful to you. Like it might be just something as simple as square breathing, or being reminded to use all of your senses to kind of place yourself in the present, or just to go for a walk. But there'll be something there that will kind of is worth referring back to. And then more recently, and it took a while to get to this point, I also decided that I should go onto some medication. So again, went back to my GP and have been on a low dose of antidepressants for about a year now. And so the combination of those two things, plus a change in job that's now financially more secure, means that I'm feeling really good mentally and physically, and know as well that I can now see some of the signs of how I might, be struggling, and see those sooner, so I know to be able to act on those sooner as well.
It's good to hear that it's improved significantly, and I think it's interesting as well. You talk about sort of that combination of different routes to improve it. So there's the medical side, there's the antidepressants, but there's also the sort of CBT side. Presumably, it wouldn't be as effective without either of those. You just having one of those, it's sort of, in your case, that wouldn't have been enough to get you where you are.
Yeah, and I think I didn't realise and appreciate that soon enough as well. I was quite anti the idea of taking medication. I felt in particular that when it comes to something to do with mental health, that my misperception of what sertraline would do would be it would potentially change my personality, and it doesn't at all. And actually, from a scientific perspective, what's happening in your body is chemical reactions, and these are happening. They're just going to happen, and they're a natural response of your body to keep you safe, but that are causing you these problems in the first place. So if you do the CBT, then you can manage how those chemicals are being kind of playing out in your body, but you can't necessarily manage them to the point of disappearing. You can manage them to a certain extent, but if you're really struggling and it's long-standing issues of anxiety, depression, or low mood, then you probably do need to get the medical support as well as the CBT support.
Great, well, thanks. So I think that the final area that'd be good to have a chat about is really, what can we do about it? And I think it's good to sort of look at this in two areas. One is, what can we all do to perhaps manage our own mental health better? And then also, what we need to do to change our workplaces and our culture, perhaps as a sector. So, in terms of managing our own mental health better, I think it's worth repeating the same things that we've said already a couple of times, is that, if people are experiencing any problems, then seek help. Trust your own instinct and your own judgment on it, and go to your own GP or the healthcare provider. But what are some of the other things that have worked for you, David? I think we've had a talk in previous sessions together about sort of some of the things that have worked for you. What would you sort of suggest are useful things people can do?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of things. So I think the first thing that you can do, and it's quite quick to do, is so I'll have maybe a worry list. You know, I'll have a work list that's got all of my tasks on that I'm busy doing, but sometimes I might find that something's just going round and round in my head, and I've not noticed it to start with. It's just subconscious, and then suddenly it comes up and it starts to become a distraction, and it's slowing me down and making me less productive. So instead of it just continuing to just fester, if I was to just write it out at the top of this list, then I can tell myself at 4:45 at the end of the day, I'll go back to this list of things that I've got worries on, and I can actually spend a bit of time just focusing on what I could do about it. So the first thing I could do is write it down and just push it to one side. And the physicality of just writing it down and putting it to one side means that you don't have the anxiety of losing the worry. Where did the worry go? And what could I, what should I be worrying about? You've written it down and it's there for you to look at, but it's now, it doesn't need to distract you and it doesn't need to sit in front of your mind.
It's externalized, doesn't it?
You've written, and in fact, you might then come back to it at the end of the day. Well, what was that about? It doesn't matter. Or it's somebody else's problem and you're just struggling with it because you're wrestling with the idea, but you now understand it. So just giving yourself that bit of time and structure to kind of allow yourself to worry, because it's a very natural thing to do. So just let it happen, but find a way to better manage it. And then I also try to force myself out almost every day if I can at lunchtime, especially since most of us have been home working either entirely or mostly, to get away from the desk and to stretch my legs. So I'll go for a half-hour run, or I'll walk the dog, or I'll just go outside and stretch my legs, or sit in the sun if it's a nice day, and just keep myself away from the desk. So I'm breaking up the day and I'm taking some time out away from the screen. And if I'm able to get some exercise, then again, that's good for my endorphins, and it's good for how I'm feeling. It's good for my physical health as well as my mental health. Similarly, if you're into meditation or taking time out just to kind of find that sense of presence, whether you're spiritual, religious or not, there's something to be said about focusing on your breathing and just how powerful that can be for making you feel planted and relaxed. I'll talk with friends, inside and out of work, and start a conversation. Sometimes that conversation could be just purely for the sake of distraction. It could be that you're talking about something entirely different, the football that's coming on the weekend, or where you're going on holiday, or listening to somebody else's problems to help you with getting your own perspective, or to give somebody else that bit of support. Or it might be that you want to spend some time just talking to them about not feeling good if you're not feeling good.
Because I think even reaching out for help to somebody, even in a sort of fairly gentle way, is actually a really good way of bringing yourself closer to the people, isn't it? As well, it's known as a good way of actually connecting with people. Yeah, if you need
very much so. And giving yourself a license, to know and understand that it's all right to not feel all right. That it's a natural thing, and that there are times where you won't feel okay, and it's impossible to just feel euphoric and happy every day, all of the time. It doesn't work like that. So to understand that there are times when you might not be feeling great. So that element of self-awareness and understanding your feelings and your actions and behaviours is an important part of this as well. And then finally, I'd say, as well as going to the GP, there are lots of groups that are out there. Some are informal and some are formal. That the voluntary sector in particular has got a real host of world-leading mental health organisations out there that either give you free advice or free help or guidance. So again, there are organisations there that you can turn to, and Google is kind of a useful friend in helping you to find the right organisations and resources that are around you to help you out.
Yeah, those are really useful points. I think a couple of other things I've sort of pulled out of what you were saying earlier was also that just being able to go and take a break. I mean, taking a break in the first place is a really good thing, because it enables you to stand back a little bit and sort of depressurize, but also if you can get out into nature is obviously a great healing thing for people, and the idea of exercise as well. I know that that's incredibly important for a lot of people. And somebody I was talking to the other day in the charity sector had come up with a great idea as well about finding this sort of support network that you were talking about, not just of chatting to colleagues, but actually he was talking about almost like a buddy system where you have somebody that or it could be several people that from, whether it's in your same sector or otherwise, but that you meet, say, on a monthly basis, and just, you don't do the small talk, you just go straight into what's happening in your life, what's happening at work, and that you can base it entirely on work and go, well, okay, well, what's worrying you, what's not. And if you're from a different organization, that's even better, because you can be really, really open about what's going on. But he found that sort of that monthly or fortnightly catch up with someone just to offload, and where you listen to each other, that can be really powerful.
Definitely, yeah. I've experienced that through 2 different organizations, albeit that they're not cheap organizations to be to do things through. But one is the Leadership Trust. I went on a really fantastic course that they've been running for over 40 years called Leadership in Management, and it's a residential course that lasts a week. But one of the spin-offs of that is that we've stayed in contact with each other in the main group that we were working in, a small group of 6 of us, and none of those other people are in the charity sector. There's somebody who builds boats in Scotland, and there's somebody else who runs a manufacturing industry kind of thing, creating bolts, and they're all from different places. But yeah, we do exactly that. We kind of just dive into the nitty-gritty of what's going on in our lives, and what problems we've got, and how we might be able to fix them together, and just share that kind of experience together. Yeah, so doing that peer-to-peer. There's another one called MD to MD, which is for managing directors, but it would work at any level, in any layer of work. So it would work for fundraisers too. And you just share a problem or a challenge that you've got, and then the group starts to ask you a few questions about what it is that to define the problem, and then they come back saying, well, if I was in your shoes, these are the things that I'd do next, and you come away with a kind of a list of actions that take really quickly, that work really well.
Great. I think there's hopefully some really useful stuff there for people to reflect on. I think before we finish up for the last of 3 or 4 minutes, I wonder if perhaps we could look at what might be needed to do, what might we need to do to change our our workplaces and culture, just as a sector and as organizations. Do you have any thoughts on what would be useful for that?
Yeah, so I think from an employer's perspective, I think it's really empowering for people in leadership positions to make a point of talking about the importance of mental health and well-being, and making it an important agenda for them, so that they show leadership themselves. And depending on the individual, they might want to share their own personal experiences of mental health and well-being and the challenges they've had, but also they can, they've got the opportunity to kind of create the structure in the organisations to make it work. So that could be, you mentioned buddying. It could be that you have a buddying system where people have got that kind of safe space one-to-one with a colleague, and that's completely, it's informal and it's detached from any kind of HR procedural type stuff, but it gives people a chance to talk to each other one-to-one. It could be more formal, like mental health first aiders being trained and knowing who those are in the organisation. It could be creating the right physical spaces in buildings as well, to make, to give people places to relax, to socialise, to spend time away from the desk. It could be actually organising, social activities and things outside of work to bring people together in a more informal setting. And it could be, just doing a bit of an HR health check as well, looking through policies and procedures and the language that's being used in those policy procedures about the value of people and the importance of mental health and well-being. So yeah, I think there's a lot that employers can do, and not all of it needs to cost money. It's more about a shifting of culture, to be kind of aware of the importance of mental well-being amongst the workforce.
I imagine there's quite a difference between different organizations as to how much they think about this and how much they deal with this already, and the pressures they put on people. So perhaps it's about looking at one's own organization and seeing what one can do. And apart from lobbying the organisation to take it more seriously, I guess we can all just actually take steps ourselves to show that we want to help. That we can offer to be a buddy for someone, or we can talk about it in a more open way ourselves, and just so that the conversation gets started in the organisation and it's recognised that it's an issue for at least one of the employees.
Definitely, yeah. It reminds me actually of I used to work for the Ramblers, and so unsurprisingly, I'd go for a walk with somebody from the office. We just, if I could see that somebody was struggling, then we go out for half an hour and just leave the office and walk along the river and away from everybody else and just chat, and then go back into the office again. And it worked really well.